Search and rescue was more than just a passion for me. It was a way of life. I had spent years training, honing my skills, learning to navigate dense forests, rugged mountains, and unpredictable weather conditions. It was never just about finding lost hikers or recovering remains. It was about being prepared for the unknown. Every fall, our team held an annual retreat, part training, part bonding, a chance to sharpen our skills and reconnect outside of high-stress missions. This year, we were in one of the more remote regions of the state, miles away from the nearest town, deep in the backcountry. The land stretched out endlessly, rolling hills, thick forest, and narrow creek beds that could turn deadly with a sudden storm. It was an area known for unpredictable floods, shifting terrain, and, as I would later learn, something even worse. I had brought Brody, my search and rescue dog, a highly trained cadaver and man-trailing specialist. He had been my partner for years, his sharp nose and unwavering loyalty proving invaluable in the field. His presence alone made me feel safer, though that night, I would come to understand just how much I relied on him. The training that evening was meant to simulate a real search scenario, navigating the woods at night, tracking a hidden target, and working in small teams to hone our coordination. The sky was clouded over, the moon barely visible through the thick canopy. The air was damp, filled with the scent of earth and decaying leaves, a reminder of recent rain that had turned the trails into slick mud. Brody moved ahead of me, his nose low, scanning for a scent. I followed, my flashlight casting a narrow beam ahead, my boots crunching softly over wet leaves. The team was spread out, voices occasionally drifting through the trees as we called out for location checks. Everything was routine, until Brody stopped. His body went rigid, ears forward, tail stiff. Then, he turned sharply, veering off the designated path, his focus locked onto something unseen. "Brody, what is it?" He didn't react to my voice, didn't hesitate. He was trailing something, and that worried me. The training exercise wasn't designed to go this far out. The target we were supposed to find had been placed in a completely different direction. Whatever Brody had locked onto, it wasn't part of the drill. I hesitated for only a second before following. The deeper we went, the quieter the forest became. The usual rustling of small animals, the distant hoot of an owl gone. The stillness was unnatural, oppressive. I was so focused on Brody that I didn't notice the ground beneath me had changed until it was too late. 1 second, I was moving forward, and the next, the earth gave way beneath me. My feet slid out, my body pitching forward as the ground crumbled. I tried to grab onto something, anything, but the slope was slick with mud, and gravity had its hold on me. Pain exploded through my side as I tumbled down a steep incline, my body slamming against rocks, roots, and damp earth. The world spun, my vision blurring as I landed hard at the bottom of a dry creek bed. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. A sharp, searing pain shot through my ribs with every attempt to inhale. My head throbbed, a dull ache settling behind my eyes. When I finally managed a breath, it was shallow, painful, and ragged. Broken ribs, at least 2. Concussion, likely. I tried to sit up but stopped when another wave of dizziness hit. Instead, I reached for the GPS strapped to my chest, my fingers shaking as I pressed the emergency alert button. The signal would go straight to base camp, letting them know I was either lost or in need of immediate assistance. Then I realized something. Brody was gone. The stranger. I forced myself to listen, every nerve in my body on edge. Footsteps, not from my team. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. My flashlight had landed a few feet away, its beam casting an eerie glow across the creek bed. And then, just beyond its reach, I saw him, a man. He was standing just above the edge of the creek bed, looking down at me. His posture was relaxed, hands in his pockets, head slightly tilted. He didn't move to help, didn't call out, just watched. "You all right down there?" His voice was casual, too casual. Something was off. I didn't answer. Every instinct in my body screamed that something wasn't right. He hadn't asked if I needed help, hadn't reacted with concern, just stood there, studying me. "You know," he continued, Lot of people end up in these creeks. My blood went cold. Flash floods come through fast, he mused. Real fast. Sweep people away before they even know what hit him. I stayed silent, my mind racing. My team wasn't far. They had to be on their way. But this man, he was looking for a way down. I could hear the leaves shifting as he stepped forward, scanning for a path into the creek bed. My body was useless. I could barely breathe, let alone fight. Then a sound, a familiar one, a low, rolling aroo, followed by an urgent series of trills and whines. Brody, he wasn't alone. A shadow emerged from the trees first, a massive German Shepherd, one of our team's other SAR dogs. Ranger. His body was stiff, ears forward, tail high. Then came Brody, his own posture tense, a deep growl rumbling from his chest. The man hesitated. Ranger bared his teeth, his growl escalating into a full, throaty snarl. Brody matched him, the two dogs standing side by side, their eyes locked onto the man. Then movement. Two of my team members pushed through the underbrush, flashlights swinging wildly as they spotted me. One was a former Marine, the other a trained fighter. Both were armed. The man took a step back. Ranger let out a single, sharp bark, the kind that meant, leave, now. And he did. He turned without a word, disappearing into the trees as my team reached me. My teammates worked quickly, stabilizing me, securing me to the backboard before loading me onto the wheelie, a single-wheeled ATV stretcher designed for rough terrain. As they hauled me out, I caught one last look at the darkness where the man had vanished. The aftermath. At camp, our medics checked me over before sending me to the nearest hospital, a 2-hour drive through backroads and forest. A nurse, after hearing where I had been, frowned. That area? She said. Lots of trouble out there. People go missing. Assaults. Worse. We filed a report with the police. Nothing ever came of it. No suspects, no arrests. Just another unexplained encounter in the deep woods. To this day, I don't know what Brody was following that night. Maybe it was the man himself. Maybe someone else had been out there. All I know is that if he had reached me first, if Brody and Ranger hadn't shown up when they did, I wouldn't be here. Brody is retired now. Ranger will be soon. But I still go into the woods. I still train. And sometimes, in the silence of the trees, I think about that night, and I wonder if he's still out there. Backpacking had always been a passion of mine. The exhaustion, the aches, the sore feet, none of it compared to the freedom of being out in the wild, disconnected from the world, surrounded by nothing but trees, dirt, and sky. Every trip was a test of endurance, a reminder of my place in something much bigger. In 2018, I joined a backpacking group for a multi-day trek in North Carolina. The trip had been challenging but rewarding. Grueling hikes, breathtaking views, nights spent around a campfire with like-minded people. By the third day, I felt strong, settled into the rhythm of the trail. That morning, we set out to summit Pilot Mountain. The smaller one, why were there two? Anyway, the hike was steep but manageable, and when we finally reached the peak, it felt worth it. The view stretched for miles. Rolling hills, dense forest, the sky vast and cloudless. We took photos, laughed, ate snacks, and for a while, everything was perfect. Then we started the descent. At first, it was just a flicker of dizziness. I paused, adjusted my footing, blinked hard. Maybe I hadn't eaten enough. Maybe I was dehydrated. But the ground beneath me swayed, and before I could react, the world tilted violently. Vertigo hit me like a train, collapsed. The sudden motion flipped something inside me, and within seconds, I was throwing up, my body violently rejecting whatever was inside me. The nausea was unbearable, an endless cycle of vomiting, shaking, gasping for air. My limbs felt weak, unsteady, my vision swimming in and out of focus. I heard voices, concerned, urgent, but they felt distant. My body was on fire and freezing at the same time, waves of hot and cold crashing over me. Someone pressed a hand to my back, Another steadied my shoulders, but all I could do was shiver and gag. Minutes passed, then an hour. The guide made the call. The others had to move on. The temperature was dropping fast, and setting up camp before dark was a priority. A few people hesitated, wanting to stay, but in the end, they followed orders. It was just me, the main guide, and the growing darkness. The wait for rescue. Time became strange. I faded in and out, the world a blur of movement and pain. I was vaguely aware of the guide talking on the radio, requesting a rescue team. The temperature kept dropping. What had been a brisk but manageable 50 or 60 degrees was now plummeting toward the teens. Cold settled deep in my bones, but the worst part was knowing it was going to get worse. It took an hour for an EMT to reach us. By then, I was too weak to sit up. They assessed me quickly. Severe vertigo, worsening hypothermia, dehydration. Vomiting had left me too drained to even drink water. And 4 was necessary. I barely felt the needle. At first, the cold creeping into my veins was a relief, like drinking ice water on a hot day. Then it became unbearable. I couldn't stop shivering, my body curling in on itself instinctively. The EMT wrapped me in an emergency blanket, but it was barely enough. The rescue team was still working their way up. The terrain was too rough for a stretcher, so they were literally cutting a new path. Chainsaws echoed through the trees. The wait stretched into eternity. The EMT and guide whispered back and forth. My condition was worsening. The 4 fluid was helping, but it was also lowering my core temperature too fast. They made the call, get a helicopter on standby. Darkness swallowed the mountain. The wind cut through my layers, sharp and relentless. I stopped feeling my fingers. My lips felt stiff when I tried to speak. My own body was shutting down on me, and there was nothing I could do but lie there, barely conscious, waiting. At some point, I started hallucinating. Shadowy figures flickered at the edges of my vision, shapes moving in the trees. I knew it wasn't real, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the woods anymore. Then voices, real ones, the rescue team. They reached me around 9 p.m., almost 9 hours after I first collapsed. Faces hovered above me, flashlights blinding. More hands, more movement. A stretcher, straps secured around my arms and legs. They lifted me. Every jolt sent a shockwave of pain through my ribs. The vertigo hadn't faded. Each motion felt like I was being flipped upside down, spun, shaken. I clenched my teeth, focusing on the cold air burning in my lungs. The descent was slow. The team carried me until they reached a clearing where they could transfer me to an ATV. The roar of the engine vibrated through my body as we finally moved toward the ambulance waiting below. The worst was over, or so I thought. The hospital ordeal. The hospital was small, rural, understaffed. The EMTs wheeled me in, rattling off my condition, and for a moment, I thought I'd be okay. They ran a CT scan, checked my heart. Everything came back normal. No stroke, no heart attack. Then, at 3 a.m., they discharged me. I still couldn't walk, couldn't even stand. I remember looking at the nurse in disbelief as she told me I was free to go. The hospital was in the middle of nowhere. No hotels, no shelters, nothing. They offered to call me a cab. That was it. No help, no place to go. I was too exhausted to fight it. Then, something unexpected. One of the nurses, young, kind, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, took pity on me. She wheeled me into an empty room, dimly lit and quiet. She brought me water, snacks, an extra blanket. She wasn't supposed to, but she let me stay until morning, when my backpacking group could come back for me. I will never forget that kindness. Aftermath. By sunrise, I was able to stand. Barely. My group arrived, faces lined with worry and relief. They had packed up camp early, eager to get me somewhere safe. Took weeks to fully recover. Even longer to stop feeling the phantom nausea, the lingering chill in my bones. To this day, I don't know what caused it. Doctors never gave me a clear answer, just bad luck, a random failure of equilibrium, a perfect storm of circumstances that almost killed me. But I do know this. So many people saved my life that day. The guide who stayed with me, the rescue team who cut a trail to reach me, the EMT who made the call for backup, the strangers who carried me off that mountain, the nurse who refused to let me be abandoned in the middle of the night. Without them, I wouldn't be here, and that's something I'll never forget. Palo Duro Canyon is an unforgiving place. Its beautiful, red rock walls rising in layered shelves, deep shadows stretching into hidden crevices, a desert so empty and silent that you can almost hear the weight of time pressing down on it. But it doesn't care about you. It doesn't care about your plans, your survival, your fragile body scrambling across its surface. I had explored the area plenty of times, always drawn to the solitude, the mystery of it. The marked trails were nice, but the real beauty, the real adventure was off-trail where few people ever set foot. That day, I had gone deeper into the canyon than I ever had before. I don't remember exactly how far I had hiked, but it had been hours. No cell signal, no signs of other hikers, just me, my backpack, and the endless stretch of rock and dirt beneath a cloudless sky. It was perfect, until the ground disappeared beneath me. 1 second, I was stepping forward, adjusting my footing on a patch of loose clay. The next, there was nothing under me. The world dropped away. I had a brief, gut-clenching moment of weightlessness, just enough time for my brain to process that something was very, very wrong, before I slammed into the walls of a narrow shaft. Red clay and rock scraped against my arms, my back, my legs. I barely had time to react before I was sliding, tumbling downward, dirt and pebbles rolling with me. Then a sudden, brutal stop. My backpack wedged me between the walls of the chute, locking me in place. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My heart pounded in my ears as I tried to process where I was, what had just happened. I was trapped. Took me a few seconds to realize just how bad the situation was. I was stuck in a narrow vertical shaft, deep enough that sunlight barely reached me. The walls were slick with dry, powdery clay, the kind that crumbled at the slightest touch. I didn't know how deep it went below me, but it felt endless. My backpack had saved me from sliding all the way down, but now it was a problem. Wedged between the walls, it pinned my arms at an awkward angle, making movement difficult. I had no idea how far I had fallen, only that the air around me felt heavier, colder. I twisted my head, trying to look up. The opening was there, far above me, a jagged hole in the earth. I could see a sliver of blue sky, hear the faint whisper of wind rushing across the canyon. But I was alone, miles from any trail. No one knew where I was. I had no choice. I had to get out. I tried to move my arms, but my pack was wedged too tightly. I shifted, inch by inch, gritting my teeth as my body scraped against the rough walls. The clay crumbled under my fingers, offering no grip. I had to get the backpack off. Took everything I had to wiggle my shoulders free. The moment I unlatched the straps, the pack slipped downward and kept going. I heard it slide, knocking loose dirt and pebbles as it tumbled into the darkness below. It didn't hit anything, just silence. I swallowed hard. That could have been me. Now, without the pack, I had more room to move. I pressed my palms against the walls, my boots trying to find purchase. I pushed upward. The first few inches felt promising. Then suddenly I lost traction and slid back down. My stomach lurched as I felt myself dropping again, my arms flailing wildly for any kind of grip. My boots scraped uselessly against the clay, sending more dirt cascading down into whatever void was beneath me. I barely stopped myself in time, catching onto a slightly firmer section of the wall. My breath came in ragged gasps. This wasn't going to be easy. The fight for every inch. I had to be slow, careful. Every push upward was a fight. The clay was unstable, shifting under my weight. My legs burned from the effort, my arms shaking with every inch I gained. For what felt like hours, I climbed. I slid back countless times, each one stealing a little more of my strength. My hands were raw, my fingers caked in dust. Sweat dripped into my eyes, mixing with the dirt on my skin. At one point, I almost gave up. I was exhausted. My body screamed at me to stop, to just let go. I thought about how easy it would be to let myself slide down, to rest. but I didn't know if I'd ever stop falling, so I kept going. At some point, my fingers scraped something solid. I looked up, hardly believing it. The rim of the hole was close. Summoning every last bit of strength, I reached up, dug my fingers into the edge and pulled. My arms felt like they were tearing apart, my legs kicking uselessly against the wall. My boots scrambled for one final push, and then I was out. I collapsed onto solid ground, gasping. My body trembled violently, covered in dirt and sweat. I didn't move for a long time, just lay there, staring up at the sky, listening to the wind whistle through the canyon. I had made it. When I finally got to my feet, my legs nearly gave out. I was covered in scrapes, my clothes torn. My pack was gone, along with my water, my food, my map. The realization sent a new wave of fear through me. I wasn't out of danger yet. I was still miles from camp, disoriented, shaken. I had no way to call for help, but I was alive. I moved slowly, carefully, forcing my legs to carry me forward. The hike back was a blur of exhaustion and pain. Every step felt like it might be my last, but I refused to stop. Somehow, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the familiar sight of my campsite in the distance. Relief nearly knocked me over. The cave that didn't exist. The next day, after recovering, I tried to find the hole again. I wanted to see it, to prove to myself it was real. I wanted to show my wife, to make sense of what had happened. But no matter how hard I searched, I couldn't find it. I retraced my steps, convinced I knew where it should be. I checked every patch of ground, every dip, every crack in the earth. Nothing. It was like the canyon had swallowed it whole. Even now, years later, I still think about that hole, that chute, that endless drop into nothingness. And I know with absolute certainty, if my backpack hadn't jammed me in place, I never would have made it out. I always liked camping alone. People think that's strange, but I never saw the risk in it. I was careful. I knew how to handle myself in the woods. I wasn't reckless. I carried a GPS, a personal locator beacon, and enough supplies to last twice as long as my planned trip. To me, the wilderness was peaceful. The quiet, the isolation, the feeling of being completely removed from the world. It was perfect. But after what happened, I don't go alone anymore. I had planned a 3-day trip deep in the mountains, a spot I had found on an old map. It was remote. No trails, no campsites, nothing but endless forest. That was exactly what I wanted. I started the hike early, making my way up through dense pines and rocky terrain. The first day was uneventful. I set up camp near a small creek, cooked a quick meal, and listened to the sounds of the forest as the sun dipped behind the mountains. By nightfall, the air was cool, and the stars were sharp and clear above the treetops. I sat by my small fire, enjoying the solitude. That was the last moment I felt comfortable. Something was watching. The first strange thing happened as I was getting ready to sleep. I had just zipped myself into my sleeping bag when I heard something outside my tent. A soft, slow movement. Not an animal, at least not a normal one. Animals move with purpose. A deer walks through the woods, not around a campsite. A raccoon scurries, it doesn't linger. This sound was different. It was slow, deliberate, circling. I held my breath and listened. My fire had burned down to embers, leaving only faint orange light flickering against the tent walls. Silence, then crunch. A single footstep. Close. I sat up, heart pounding. I wasn't armed, but I had a knife in my pack. I reached for it, my fingers closing around the handle just as I heard another crunch of footsteps, this time on the other side of the tent. I unzipped the flap just enough to peek out. Nothing. The forest was empty. My fire was dying. The night was perfectly still. But I knew something had been there. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I convinced myself it had been an animal. Maybe a curious coyote. Maybe even the wind shifting the trees in just the right way. I broke camp and hiked deeper into the mountains. The day passed without anything unusual. The woods felt normal again, and I let myself relax. By late afternoon, I found a flat stretch of land near a rocky outcrop and decided to set up camp early. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It felt safe. But that night, it happened again. I was cooking dinner when I felt it, that same feeling. Something was watching me. I turned quickly, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just dense forest and the creeping darkness of nightfall. I told myself I was being paranoid. I forced myself to focus on my meal, on the crackling fire. And then I saw him, a man, standing just beyond the light of my fire. His body was stiff, his posture unnatural. He was too far to make out details, but I could tell something was wrong with him. His limbs were long, too thin. His head tilted slightly to one side, like his neck couldn't support it properly. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching. A chill ran through me, but I kept my expression blank. My knife was in my hand before I even realized I had grabbed it. I didn't want to provoke him, but I needed to show that I wasn't afraid. Slowly, deliberately, I reached for my flashlight. My hand was steady. I clicked it on and pointed it at him. He was gone. Nothing but trees. I swallowed hard. My skin crawled. I wasn't alone out here. I didn't sleep that night either. By morning, I had a decision to make. The trip was supposed to last another night, but I didn't care. I was leaving. I packed fast, my eyes scanning the trees every few seconds. The forest felt different now, no longer peaceful. I started hiking back the way I had come. The feeling of being watched never left me. Every so often, I would hear something behind me, the sound of a footstep, a rustle of leaves. I stopped more than once, spinning around, trying to catch him, but there was nothing. And then, around midday, I found the footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, deep, following me. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out here. Someone was tracking me. My stomach turned to ice. I didn't stop again. I hiked faster, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. Every muscle burned. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't slow down. The forest stretched endlessly around me. No landmarks, no signs of civilization. My GPS told me I was on the right path, but it didn't feel like I was getting anywhere. I kept moving. Hours passed. The sun dipped lower in the sky, and I knew I wouldn't make it back before dark. But stopping was not an option. Then I saw it, a cabin. It wasn't on my map. It wasn't supposed to be there. It was small, run down. A single window boarded up, a door that looked half-rotted. But it was shelter. I hesitated for only a second before rushing toward it. The door was unlocked. I stepped inside, slamming it shut behind me. The inside was worse than I expected. Dust coated every surface. There was no furniture, just an empty room with a dirt-covered floor. The air was stale, thick with decay. But it was safe, or at least safer than the woods. I pressed my back against the door, gripping my knife, listening. Outside, the forest was silent. Then footsteps, slow, close, stopping just outside the door. I held my breath. The silence stretched. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Then the doorknob turned. I braced my weight against the door, forcing it shut. The knob twisted harder. Then silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Finally, when I was sure he was gone, I slid down onto the dirt floor and gripped my knife tighter. I didn't sleep. I waited for sunrise. At first light, I was moving. I forced myself out of the cabin, my entire body aching with exhaustion. The woods were empty. The footprints were still there. I ran. I didn't stop until I saw my car. I didn't look back. I never reported it. What would I even say? A weird-looking man watched me in the woods? A door handle turned? There was no proof, but I know what I saw. I haven't camped alone since, and I never will again. I've always loved the woods. There's something about being out there, away from everything, that makes the world feel simpler. I grew up camping and hiking, learning how to navigate with a map and compass, how to build a fire, how to respect the land. I've done solo trips before, but this time I wanted to push myself. No trails, no designated campsites, just pure wilderness. I picked an area deep in the Pacific Northwest, somewhere far from any towns or popular hiking spots. I planned for 5 days, long enough to challenge myself, short enough to keep my pack light. I had food, water filtration, a tent, a knife, a compass, and a map. No GPS, no cell service. Just me and the land. I parked my truck on an old logging road, shouldered my pack, and started walking. The first day was perfect. The forest was thick but beautiful. Towering pines, soft beds of moss, the occasional deer darting through the trees. I made good time, covering about 10 miles before setting up camp near a small creek. I boiled water, ate a quick meal, and fell asleep to the sound of running water. The second day, I went deeper. By midday, I had to climb over fallen logs and push through dense underbrush. The terrain got rough, steep inclines, loose rock, thick patches of ferns. I moved slower, taking breaks to check my map, making sure I was still heading in the right direction. Then I found something strange. It was just a small clearing at first, nothing unusual. But as I stepped into it, I noticed the ground was different. The dirt was loose, almost like it had been disturbed recently. I crouched down, brushing some of the dirt aside. Beneath the surface, there was something buried. It wasn't a body, not a fresh one, at least. What I uncovered was old, weathered bone, darkened by time. Not an animal either. The shape was too human. A femur, half buried, snapped at the end. I stood up fast, my chest tightening. People don't just bury bones out here. I looked around, scanning the trees, listening. The forest was silent, too silent. I took a breath, forced myself to think. This could be anything. A hunter who got lost, an old burial site. Maybe just an accident, something long forgotten. I didn't want to stay to find out. I kept moving. The next few miles felt different. Every crack of a branch made me flinch. Every shadow felt like something watching. I checked my compass, rechecked my map, kept pushing forward. Then I found the second grave. This one was fresher. The dirt was still packed down, the edges of the hole rough and uneven, like someone had dug it in a hurry. There were no bones sticking out, but I didn't need to dig to know what was underneath. I felt sick. Someone had been here recently, and they had buried something. I turned around, deciding to backtrack, but then I saw it. A footprint, not mine. The tread was deep, fresh, pressed into the damp earth. Whoever made it was wearing heavy boots, bigger than mine, and it was heading the same direction I had been walking. Someone else was out here. I moved fast. I didn't care about my original route anymore. I just wanted to get away. I hiked harder, faster, barely stopping to catch my breath. My goal now was simple. Put as much distance as possible between me and those graves before nightfall. By the time I set up camp, I was exhausted. My legs ached. My throat was dry. My hands were shaking. I forced myself to eat something, to drink water, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a mistake coming here. That night, I barely slept. Every rustle, every snap of a branch made my heart pound. At one point, I swore I heard something moving in the distance. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the leaves. But when I strained to listen, it stopped. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was done. I packed my gear and started heading back toward my truck, retracing my steps as best as I could. I moved quickly, not bothering to take in the scenery, just focusing on getting out. Then I saw another footprint. This time it was behind mine. Someone had been following me. My skin crawled. I gripped my knife, scanning the trees, but there was nothing, just the endless, empty forest. I walked faster. For hours, I pushed forward, my body running on pure adrenaline. I checked my compass, kept my bearings, forced myself to stay calm. But then, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, I realized something was wrong. I should have been closer to my truck by now. I checked my map again, tried to make sense of where I was, but the landmarks weren't lining up. The trees all looked the same. The ridges and valleys didn't match what I had planned. Somewhere along the way, I had gone off course. Or worse, someone had led me off course. I stopped, breathing hard. I needed to think. My best option was to find high ground, get a better view of the terrain, and reset my bearings. I climbed a steep ridge using tree roots to pull myself up. At the top, I scanned the horizon, looking for anything familiar. Then I saw it. Down in the valley below, maybe half a mile away, was a small cabin. I hadn't seen any sign of people out here, no trails, no roads, nothing. But there it was, nestled in the trees, old and weathered, but definitely occupied. Smoke curled from a chimney. A part of me wanted to go the other way, to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. But I was lost. I had no choice. I made my way down slowly, staying quiet, moving carefully through the trees. As I got closer, I saw details. Rusted tools hanging on the walls, stacks of firewood, an old truck parked nearby. The windows were covered with thick curtains. I stepped closer. That's when I saw the shovel. It was leaning against the cabin, the metal blade still caked with dirt. Fresh dirt. And then I noticed something else. Pair of boots. Large, muddy boots sitting just outside the door. The same tread as the footprints I had seen. My stomach turned. Whoever lived here had been following me. I backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound. My only goal now was to get away before whoever lived there knew I had found their place. I moved as quietly as I could, stepping carefully, watching every shadow. I was almost back to the ridge when I heard it. A door creaking open. I didn't look back. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, crashing through the underbrush, my lungs burning. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I just ran. Branches tore at my arms, my legs, my face. My pack bounced against my back. My vision blurred with sweat. Then finally I saw it. The road. My truck was right where I left it. I didn't stop running until I reached the door. My hands fumbled with the keys, shaking so bad I could barely get them into the lock. I threw myself inside, started the engine, and tore out of there, gravel kicking up behind me. I didn't look back. I drove for hours, not stopping until I was back in town. I found the nearest gas station, pulled over, and just sat there, my hands gripping the wheel, my entire body trembling. I don't know who was out there. I don't know how long they had been watching me. But I do know this: someone is using those woods to hide things. And I was never supposed to find them. I haven't been back since, and I never will. I've camped alone dozens of times. I always liked the solitude, the quiet, the feeling of being completely self-sufficient. Out in the wilderness, there's no phone ringing, no emails, no noise from the city. Just you, your gear, and the sounds of nature. That's what I was looking for when I planned this trip. Just 3 days, deep in the woods of a national forest, hiking off-trail, getting away from people. But I should have known something was off from the beginning. I parked my truck on a small service road, shouldered my pack, and set off into the trees. I had a good map, a GPS, and enough supplies to last longer than I needed. The plan was simple: hike out about 10 miles, set up camp near a small stream I'd marked, spend a couple of nights out there, and hike back. The first few miles were uneventful. The air was cool, the sky was overcast, and I followed an old game trail through thick pines. The farther I went, the quieter it got. No other hikers, no campsites, not even old fire rings. It was perfect, but a few hours in, I found something strange. A campsite. It was old, clearly abandoned for a while. A small fire pit, half-collapsed tent, torn-up sleeping bag. It wasn't the kind of place someone had just packed up and left. It looked ransacked. Shredded fabric, gear scattered, empty cans and food wrappers half buried under leaves. It looked like an animal had gotten to it, maybe a bear. I should have moved on, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, nudging through the mess with my boot. The sleeping bag was torn open, like something had clawed through it. The tent poles were snapped. Then I saw something that made my stomach turn. A boot. Not just a boot. A boot with the laces still tied, half buried in the dirt. And inside it, a sock. Just a sock. No foot. I stood there, staring, my brain trying to make sense of it. Had someone left in a hurry? Lost their gear? But the boot didn't look lost. It looked like it had been pulled off. Something about it felt wrong. Unnatural. I took a step back. The woods felt different now. Too quiet. I had that creeping sensation you get when you know you're being watched. I forced myself to turn and keep moving. I didn't look back. By late afternoon, I reached the stream and set up camp. The unease from earlier was still there, sitting in the back of my mind, but I forced myself to shake it off. There was a rational explanation for that abandoned campsite. Maybe someone had left in a hurry. Maybe an animal had torn through it. It didn't mean anything. I built a fire, cooked dinner, and tried to enjoy the peace. The sound of the stream, the crackling fire, the occasional rustling of animals in the undergrowth. Normal sounds. I told myself I'd imagine that feeling of being watched. Then, just as the sun dipped below the trees, I saw it. A footprint. On the opposite bank of the stream, just barely visible in the fading light. A single, deep bare footprint. No shoes, no socks, and it was fresh. The hairs on my arms stood up. I told myself it could have been from a hiker earlier in the day. But the forest was remote. I hadn't seen a single sign of human activity since I left my truck, except for that destroyed campsite. And now it wasn't just the footprint that bothered me. It was where it was. The bank was wet, the mud soft and thick, but there was only one footprint. Not a trail, not a set, just one. Like someone had stood there, watching. I put out the fire. I barely slept. The next morning, I debated hiking back. Something felt wrong about this place, but I told myself I was overreacting. That's the thing about fear. Once it settles in, it twists everything. Turns shadows into threats. Sounds into danger. I forced myself to stick to my plan. One more night. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake the feeling. I followed the stream for a while, took some photos, did my best to enjoy the isolation. But I kept feeling it. That pressure, like eyes on the back of my neck. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was dipping low again. The fire felt necessary, like a barrier between me and the dark. I ate, sat with my back against a tree, and told myself I was fine. Then I heard it, a stick breaking. Not close, not far either, just beyond the tree lean, where the firelight faded into black. I held my breath. The woods were silent. Then, another snap. Closer. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. Nothing. Just empty woods. I scanned left, then right. My heart was pounding, breath shallow. I didn't see anything, but I knew. I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against the tree, hatchet in my lap, listening. The footsteps never came closer, but they didn't leave either. Every now and then, a branch would snap, a rustle of leaves, movement just out of sight. I wanted to believe it was an animal, a deer maybe, but deep down I knew better. Sometime around 3 a.m., the noises stopped. The woods went back to dead silence. I waited another hour before I packed up. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just strapped on my pack, gripped my hatchet, and started moving. The entire way back, I felt it. That unseen presence. Never getting closer, never falling too far behind. Just there, watching, waiting. I didn't run. Running triggers chases. I walked steady, forcing myself to stay calm, forcing my breathing to stay even. By the time I saw my truck, my legs were shaking. I didn't look back. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. Only then, when I was miles away from that place, did I finally let myself breathe. I don't know what was out there. Person? A wild animal? Something else? I don't know. All I know is this: I was not alone in those woods. And whatever was out there, it didn't want to be seen. It just wanted to watch. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, a soft rustling sound above the rhythmic crunch of leaves and twigs under my boots. The air was crisp, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, the way it always was in the deep woods after the first real cold snap of fall. This was my element. I had spent countless nights in terrain like this, my search and rescue team running drills, searching for lost hikers, recovering remains when things went wrong. But tonight felt different. Brody, my search and rescue dog, was moving ahead of me, his body tense, his nose low to the ground. He had caught a scent. What worried me was that I had no idea what he was tracking. The night training exercise wasn't set in this direction, and Brody wasn't prone to distractions. His focus was razor sharp, trained for both man-trailing and cadaver work. If he had locked onto something, it wasn't random. I followed him deeper into the darkness, my flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the trees. Behind me, my team members were moving as well, their own beams flickering between tree trunks, calling out occasionally to keep track of one another. I should have called Brody back, should have stopped to assess, but something in me pushed forward, my gut tightening. Then I felt the ground disappear under my feet. The descent was instant and brutal. 1 second, I was upright, pushing through underbrush, and the next, my boots lost purchase on slick ground. The mud gave way, and I was sliding, gravity yanking me down faster than I could react. My back slammed into rocks and roots as I tumbled down, the world spinning in chaotic flashes of dirt, sky, and darkness. Then nothing. I woke up to sharp pain in my ribs, every breath a battle. My head throbbed, a dull, pounding ache that sent waves of nausea rolling through me. My GPS was still strapped to my chest, and with shaking fingers, I pressed the emergency alert, our signal for when we found a target or needed help ourselves. I could hear movement above, the distant sound of my team calling my name, but it felt impossibly far away. I had landed in the creek bed, though it was mostly dry, just a few shallow pools of stagnant water reflecting the faint glow of my flashlight where it had landed a few feet away. My body protested as I tried to shift, pain lancing through my side. 2 ribs, at least, broken. Brody! My voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. I didn't see him. Panic flared in my chest, but before I could call again, I heard something else. Footsteps. They weren't from my team. These were slow, deliberate, coming closer. I turned my head carefully, scanning the darkness, and then I saw him, a man, just standing there. He was a little ways up the incline, looking down at me. The light from my flashlight barely reached him, but I could make out the shape of him. Tall, lanky, clothes hanging a little loose, like they didn't quite fit right. His posture was strange, head tilted, like he was studying me. "You all right down there?" His voice was calm, conversational, almost friendly. Something was wrong. People don't just wander up on accidents like this, especially not at night, deep in the woods. Something about the way he stood there, watching me, not moving to help, sent ice through my veins. "You know, a lot of people end up in this creek," he said, almost like he was talking to himself. "Floods come through fast, sweep 'em right away." I didn't respond. My breathing was shallow, my body still trying to process the pain, but my mind was running a mile a minute. My team wasn't far, but they hadn't reached me yet. I was vulnerable. I saw him shift his weight, scanning the slope, looking for a way down. I tried to force my voice to come out stronger. "I have people coming." He didn't answer, just took another step closer to the edge. I felt my pulse hammer in my throat. If he got down here, I wouldn't be able to fight him off. Then sound, a familiar one. A series of trills, rolled Aru noises, urgent and close. Brody. He wasn't alone. A dark shape emerged first, a massive German Shepherd, one of our team's other SAR dogs. Ranger. His body was rigid, hackles raised, teeth bared. A deep, rumbling growl built in his chest. Not the kind meant to scare off a coyote or warn a stranger, but the kind that said, "I will tear you apart." Brody appeared a second later, his own stance just as aggressive. The man froze. The dogs didn't move, their focus locked onto him. Behind them, more movement. Two of my team members pushing through the trees, their lights bouncing off the branches. The man exhaled, slow and measured, and took a single step back. Ranger let out a single explosive bark, a warning, the kind that meant keep going. He did. He backed away, disappearing into the night as quickly as he had appeared. My team reached me seconds later, their voices urgent as they assessed my injuries, their hands stabilizing me. I could barely focus, my head spinning from pain and adrenaline, but I caught the tension in their faces when I told them about the man. We didn't see him again. By the time the backboard and wheelie arrived, there was no sign of him. My team kept their flashlights scanning the woods as they hauled me out, but he was gone. At camp, our medics checked me over before sending me to the nearest hospital, 2 hours away, in the middle of nowhere. A nurse, after hearing where we had been, frowned. "That area?" she said, shaking her head. "Lots of trouble out there. People go missing. Assaults. Worse." We filed a report, of course, but nothing ever came of it. No follow-up, no arrests. Just another strange, unsolved incident in the deep woods. To this day, I don't know what Brody was following that night. Maybe it was the man himself, wandering before he found me. Maybe something or someone else had been out there. All I know is that if he had reached me first, if Brody and Ranger hadn't shown up when they did, I might not be here to tell the story. Brody is long retired now. Ranger will be soon. But I still do this work, still go out into the woods, still follow trails in the dark. And sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, when the woods go quiet in that strange, waiting way, I think about that night. And I wonder if he's still out there. When I was in high school, my friends and I decided to go on a camping trip deep in the woods. We had done smaller trips before, but this time we wanted to push ourselves, hike farther, go deeper into the mountains, find a place where we wouldn't see another person for miles. It sounded like an adventure, and at that age we felt invincible. We planned for weeks, packed carefully tents, food, sleeping bags, knives, flashlights. No cell service out there, but we didn't care. That was the point. We drove out early on a Friday, parked miles from civilization, and started our hike. The trailhead was empty when we arrived. Perfect. We wanted the isolation. The first few miles were easy, wide trails, sunlight filtering through the trees. But as we got deeper, the path became narrower, the trees thicker. The sounds of the world faded. No distant hum of cars, no voices, just the wind and the crunch of our boots on the dirt. After about 6 hours of hiking, we finally found our spot. A flat clearing, just big enough for our tents, surrounded by dense trees. No signs that anyone had camped there before. We were exhausted, but we felt accomplished. We set up quickly. Tents up, firewood gathered, food prepared. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped. The woods felt different in the dark, more alive. The fire crackled, sending flickering shadows against the trees. We sat around it, eating, joking, feeling like kings of the wilderness. There was something about being that deep in the woods, knowing no one else was around. It made the world feel bigger, wilder. Eventually, exhaustion took over. One by one, we crawled into our tents. The fire burned low, just glowing embers now. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant rustle of wind through leaves. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The woods were silent, too silent. No wind, no rustling, no chirping insects, just stillness. Then I heard it, a soft sound, a step, then another, and another, not one but multiple, moving slowly, carefully all around us. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. My first thought was a bear, but bears move heavy, and these steps were light, precise, deliberate. I stayed still, straining my ears. The footsteps didn't stop. They circled us, shifting in the darkness, never rushing, never retreating. My fingers found my flashlight. My other hand tightened around the knife I had left beside me. I took a deep breath, gathered my courage, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. I clicked the flashlight on. The beam cut through the black, sweeping across the clearing. Eyes, dozens of them, staring back at me. They weren't low to the ground like an animal's. They were high man height, large, reflecting back at me, motionless in the dark. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Everything in my body screamed at me to do something, but I didn't know what. Couldn't look away. The eyes just stood there, watching. I gripped my knife tighter, my mind racing. Who were they? Why weren't they moving? Then one of them blinked, and another, a shift of a body, a faint shuffle of hooves on dirt. Hooves hit me all at once. Deer, a whole herd of them, standing silent in the night, their eyes glowing in my flashlight beam. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My body was still tense, but now it felt ridiculous. My heart pounded from fear that, just seconds ago, had felt like life or death. I turned off the flashlight, exhaled, and listened. Slowly, the deer began to move again, their hooves softly pressing into the ground as they wandered back into the trees. The sounds faded, and just like that, they were gone. I sat there for a long time, gripping my knife, staring into the dark. The adrenaline wouldn't go away. My body still felt like it was in danger, even though I knew better. I didn't sleep much after that. Every little noise made my skin crawl, even though I knew it was just the forest. By morning, when we crawled out of our tents, the world felt normal again. The sun was shining, birds were chirping. No sign of the herd from the night before. I didn't tell my friends what happened, but I'll never forget the feeling of those eyes staring back at me in the dark. I've always liked being alone in the woods. There's something about it that feels right. Away from traffic, work, noise, and people. Just me, the trees, and the open air. It's the only time I feel like I can breathe. So when I finally got a weekend off, I packed my gear, loaded up my truck, and drove out to a remote campsite deep in the woods. Not one of those busy campgrounds with families and RVs. This was an isolated spot I had found years ago, miles from any roads, where I knew no one else would be. I got there in the late afternoon. The sun was still up but beginning to lower, the sky turning a soft orange. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The site was just how I remembered it. A small clearing surrounded by thick trees, with a fire pit someone had built years before. No roads, no trails, no signs of anyone around. Perfect. I parked my truck a short distance away, grabbed my tent, and started setting up. I worked quickly, knowing it would be dark soon. First, I cleared the ground, smoothing it out before setting up my small one-person tent. Then I gathered firewood, snapping dead branches off trees and stacking them by the fire pit. As I was finishing up, I had this weird feeling, like I wasn't alone. I stopped and looked around. Nothing but trees and quiet. I shook it off and got back to work. By nightfall, I had a good fire going. I sat beside it, eating the simple meal I had packed, feeling the warmth of the flames against the cool night air. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the dark. The woods were still, except for the occasional chirp of a cricket or the distant hoot of an owl. Then I heard something, a rustling sound in the trees. Not the wind. This was heavier, like footsteps. I froze, my body going tense. The sound stopped. I stared into the darkness beyond the fire's glow, my eyes scanning the trees. I couldn't see anything, just blackness. Probably an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer. Still, something about it felt off. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the trunks and branches. Nothing. I turned the light off and tossed another log into the fire. The flames flared up, sending a warm glow across the clearing. I tried to push the feeling away, but I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I woke up to a sound in the middle of the night, a soft snap, a twig breaking, close. I held my breath, my body stiff. There was someone outside my tent. I could hear movement, slow, careful footsteps circling the campsite. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. My knife was next to me, and I gripped it tight. Another sound, closer this time, a shuffle of leaves, then breathing, slow, heavy breathing, right outside my tent. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The breathing stopped. Then, after a long, tense moment, footsteps again, this time moving away, fading into the trees. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At first light, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. My body was stiff from lying still so long. I looked around. The campsite was just as I left it. Nothing was out of place. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had been here. But I knew what I had heard. I told myself it was an animal. Maybe my mind playing tricks on me. Still, the unease wouldn't go away. I made breakfast, ate quickly, and decided to stay one more night. But I kept my knife closer. That evening, as the sun started setting, I felt it again. That feeling of being watched. I scanned the trees, but there was nothing. Just silence. I built my fire bigger than the night before, letting the flames stretch high into the dark. The light didn't reach far, but it was something. Hours passed. The fire crackled. I tried to relax. Then a sound. A soft rustling coming from the trees. I froze, my eyes locked on the darkness. The sound was slow, careful, deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then movement. A figure, standing between the trees. Not moving, just watching. My breath caught in my throat. He was tall, thin, dressed in dark clothing. His face was shadowed, barely visible beyond the reach of my flashlight. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. My grip tightened around the flashlight. My other hand went to my knife. I didn't say anything, just stood there, locked in place, my heart hammering in my chest. Then he stepped back, slowly, fading into the dark. A few seconds later, he was gone. I stood there for a long time, my flashlight still aimed at the spot where he had been. My body felt frozen. I wanted to believe it was nothing, but I saw him, and he saw me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, knife in my lap, listening. Nothing, just the occasional crackle of burning wood. But I felt him. He was out there, watching, waiting. The first light, I packed my gear fast. I didn't even eat breakfast. I threw everything into my truck, started the engine, and got out of there as fast as I could. The dirt road felt longer than I remembered. The trees seemed closer, thicker, as if they were pressing in on me. I didn't relax until I saw the highway. Only then did I let out a breath. I never went back to that campsite, never told anyone what happened, but I'll always remember that feeling, the feeling of being watched,